Great. Awesome. And I also want to say that this is a great resource. We're not going to walk through the deck step by step. I did put that in the chat. I will re-put it for anyone who has joined after I put it. Please take a look. There's amazing stuff in here. What we're really going to talk about is a little bit more high level of, some of the things that led to the recommendations in the deck. So first question I'll pose is, maybe I'll start with Sarah. I think both of you could answer this. So, a lot of the things that we know about trust and safety are things that sort of arrive with scale. And so as an early stage startup founder or designer, how do you think about anticipating that without having it be something that derails you from actually building a product in the beginning?
Such a good question. I wanted to say too, it's so cool to be here with Michael because I feel like I started my journey when you were starting up, Michael, and you were so helpful and chatting with me. So it's really cool to be here a year later talking to you about this stuff. I think it's a bit of a, in hindsight, so much of a Goldilocks problem around like two things: sizing. What is the size of the solution or the infrastructure or system you want to build for the problem that you have? And then timing. When do you do it? And how do you fit it into a larger roadmap in such a, what often I think in a startup sense feels very tight and resource constrained. I don't know that I have any magic answers for how to work through those two issues or challenges. The one thing that I do feel pretty strongly about is that it's so platform specific. And I don't think there's a universal answer to any of that. For example, our core differentiator for Pebble T2 at the time when it was first launched was that we were kinder and safer. So trust and safety was a core value proposition. I think what we learned was that we attracted people who were already bought in, were up for the norms that we wanted to set, and from the beginning had a pretty civil, thoughtful community, which made a lot of the first things that we wanted to build, I think, coming from a post-Cambridge Analytica meta-centric environment, not really attuned to the needs of our community. I was surprised that some of the first and most dominant issues that we faced, for example, were self-harm and not misinformation or edge case political content. A lot of the culture issues that I was worried about coming from Twitter and having seen teams really grapple with. And so there were, I think we could have done a better job. And maybe the one like practical thing I'll offer is we had a Slack channel where basically any issue that was a trust and safety issue was flagged in that channel, and everyone on the team had visibility around it. And I think if we had built and prioritized our tooling purely based on what we saw in that channel, that we would have saved a lot more time in and maybe been more efficient about what we built versus some of the assumptions that we had. So that was helpful for everyone to kind of have a visceral sense for what was happening on the platform and what was really needed, as opposed to what we thought might happen or we thought we needed. The assumption that our platform would look like maybe some of these other platforms that we were more familiar with.
I love it. The context is key in so many ways, right? And to that point, Michael, I'm really curious because you've worked with companies who are doing things that are not just like a social media platform, and still have things that we have to think about for trust and safety, like marketplaces, dating apps, other things where people are interacting. What do you think that founders who are working in those spaces maybe don't think about, or what kinds of design approaches might help those kinds of platforms be a little bit more ready for the kinds of things that they're going to have to deal with?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The problems that these different companies have to deal with look very different, particularly at an early stage. Like eventually, a lot of these problems converge when you get large enough, and the platforms have the same large set of problems. But if you're creating a marketplace, you naturally have much stronger financial incentives for bad actors. There are real transactions going on the platform. You don't have to sort of convince someone with a phishing scam to click a link. You can actually sell a counterfeit product and it looks very real. So the bar to actually make money on a marketplace is lower for a bad actor. And so the bad actors just arrive at marketplace platforms sooner when the financial incentive is stronger. And likewise with other types of bad actors who take advantage of other incentives. I think it's really critical to almost sort of go through a mini sort of red team thought exercise of this is the type of platform I'm building. What are the ways that people are most likely to abuse it? And some of them are a little more obvious, and some of them you kind of have to talk to a founder who's a little further along in the same industry that you're in to see what problems they've dealt with when they get to the next stage of growth. Yeah, the other thing I wanted to touch on was the number of users. Often people ask, like, at what point do I actually start having to care about this, or will harm start arriving to the platform? And I think people want a straight answer of once you get 10,000 monthly active users, everything comes flooding in. No one can predict exactly when that's going to happen. And it's a very similar choice. Like if you're an engineer building a company and you choose the really quick database that doesn't scale very much, or the more robust one that you're investing in long-term because you know you're going to scale, it's a very similar choice. I think engineers are very used to making that choice and knowing exactly what the switching costs will be. I think very few people know what the switching cost will be for like turning on a robust trust and safety solution when you don't have one in place. So people kind of shy away from making the decision to invest early in it. I think a deck like this makes it a lot more tangible to say, what do I actually need to do from day one so that it's not sort of this abstract thing that I'm not really sure how to build? Like, what are the tangible steps? Okay, it doesn't look that bad. I can do them today. It's an investment for the future. It's not a year's worth of work. Just like I'm not going to delay the launch of my product for a year. So I think outlining these concrete steps that every company can do, but also kind of red teaming, thought exercising what is specific to your platform is critical.
I'm really curious, and there's always a bit of a tension between what kind of tools that you can put in, especially early stage where you're probably relying on some third-party solutions, and like user privacy and user data, right? So like a lot of people are now very tuned into not wanting to use a product that tracks them in all these different ways, even though they're already using products that track them in these different ways. As a new founder or a new company, you're going to be scrutinized a lot more. And at the same time, you need to be able to keep people safe. How do we think about balancing those competing, or are they competing? Am I making a false dichotomy?
Yeah,
Michael,
sure. Yeah. So obviously there's the end-to-end encryption route, which is I will prioritize user privacy, and you don't have to think about the issue of the privacy trade-off. It obviously makes trust and safety a lot harder, and I see very few founders going that route with early stage companies, partially because it's very hard to build well, and partially because it has a lot of limitations, and often founders can't even see how well their product is doing in the real world if they don't know what users are doing on the product. And most founders want like constant feedback loops and visibility into what's happening on their product. I do think there are some standard practices, like if you're considering using a vendor or a partner for a certain type of like data analysis, for example, a trust and safety vendor, There are certain things that they should absolutely have in place that you can pretty easily check. Do they encrypt data in transit and at rest? To do that, like there's a sort of a standard data security questionnaire. And then there are decisions about what exactly do you share with them. It's probably not the best idea to give them everything in your database. And you can very severely limit what you're sharing, like maybe raw messages with PII scrubbed without the user's actual characteristics. Like maybe you have the user's characteristics in your own database, but you're not sharing that with this external party that doesn't necessarily need it. And you can kind of, I would recommend starting with the minimal amount of data and slowly expanding to see if those additional pieces of data help with whatever the vendor's helping you with, rather than starting wide and narrowing in. Yeah.
So I'd love to hear, Sarah, from you, now that you're at this place, I mean, there's obviously going through the startup journey is so much a roller coaster in general, but thinking back on what specifically around designing your platform and what you learned, what would you share with the folks here about, maybe some things that you thought people should, in terms of, especially around trust and safety concerns, what did you learn?
I think the biggest meta takeaway is that sustainable trust and safety just takes time. And that's really hard in a startup environment because you often don't have time. It's hard to know. I mean, we had 20,000 users, and then a daily active of about 7,000 to 8,000. Monthly active was a lot better, which I continue to believe was an early signal that a lot of the community norms that we've built were actually working, and that people were happy to check in every now and then and not daily. But that was a hard story to tell in the current funding environment, where I just feel like in consumer tech, people have very strong views about metrics and daily active usage. And so I think it's really hard to tell this story about building a system that is thinking about upstream investments, regenerative approaches to healthy online spaces. A lot of that stuff, I think you don't reap the benefits of until much later, right? When you are at scale, when you have these dynamics feeding into each other in a way that is really hard to show and demonstrate at the early stage. I will say one thing that we did notice, and that maybe we could have leaned more into, is around flagging and reporting and just hearing about issues. We noticed even as we were growing, the number of things that were happening that were problematic or being reported or being proactively detected. We used Amazon and a mix of Amazon recognition and perspective just to do basic image and text detection, started to decouple at a certain point. And we wondered if that was because of the vetting that we were doing off our wait list to get certain to have just a basic check to make sure you weren't a spam or an active account that had a history of abuse, and the norms that were being set. So it was very common, for example, if you said something that was inflammatory or borderline, that a bunch of people on the platform would jump in and like ask you questions about it. Nothing that would, tip over the edge. I think maybe there were only one or two really heated threads that I can think of that made people feel uncomfortable, but just like, hey, that's not cool, or like, please don't say that here, or like really positive, encouraging counter messaging was happening. So aside from, raise more money in the beginning so you can have a longer runway, I would say building in really, really early tests to very quickly evaluate whether some of these investments are building the community norms that you're looking for, and being able to tell that story in a way that's metric specific, I think is really, really important at the early stage.
That's such a great point. And Michael, I'm curious what you've seen in terms of investors actually caring about trust and safety. So there's a little bit of a story in my mind that certainly part of the reason why we have what we have today in the world of social media and the problems are that investors did not care whatsoever. They cared much more about growth and about seeing your numbers in that department, and much less about people being nice to each other. So what's your sense about that?
So like every problem, there are some investors that do care and plenty that don't. And I think the trend has been investors who have had companies they've invested in that have gotten burned for trust and safety problems care a lot. And that's one of the first questions they will ask in every consumer product pitch that they receive. And we do get companies coming to us saying, hey, we haven't even launched the product yet, but we're trying to raise a round, and our investors are saying you have to figure out trust and safety before or at least have a plan before we consider giving you money. I have definitely seen the other side, which is investors that don't care and they say you'll figure it out later. Like, this only becomes a problem if you grow, which obviously is not the way most of us think about it. So like anything, if I always recommend, like, try to find an investor whose values you align with, and it just becomes a much more fruitful and easier relationship, and they will be much more helpful. But sadly, you're right, Laura, that there are investors out there that don't care and that will continue to push their portfolio companies in the wrong direction. And those companies either end up not succeeding or for unrelated reasons, or they succeed and have to face trust and safety problems much later on, and it becomes a huge headache where it could have been probably more strategically handled earlier on.
This exposes the reason why we have a lot of founder networks, so we can share about these details about who to go to and who to trust, and all of these different dimensions. I really appreciate that. So I'm going to stop our recording time so that we can now move on to Q&A. Or Julie's going to stop the recording.